Welcome, and we are really happy that you are here, and I'm happy to welcome our today's keynote speaker, Cara Daggett. Cara is a professor in the Department of Political Science at Virginia Tech in the United States, and currently she is a senior fellow at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam. She's particularly interested in the politics of energy, in the nexus between energy, labor, and social power, and its role in the aggravation of the socio-ecological crisis. Many of you will have heard about her article on Petro-masculinity, fossil fuels, and authoritarian desire that was originally published in 2018 in the international relations journal Millennium, and then translated into several languages. In Germany, the text was published as a book by the Berlin-based publisher Mattes & Seitz. For me personally, this text was an eye-opener. It contains a very concise analysis, in Germany would say a Zeitdiagnose, of how today's major crisis, namely the climate crisis, which is due to the burning of fossil fuels, the rise of the extreme right, racism, the soaring social inequality, a patriarchal order, and the symbolic and physical violence against people who deviate from dominant gender norms and identities, how these crisis phenomena are closely connected to each other. In her lecture today, Cara will build on this analysis and take it as a starting point to reflect on the relationship between labor and the environment. The title of her presentation is Petro-masculinity and the Political Ecology of Labor. A warm welcome to Cara Daggett. We are looking forward to your presentation.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here, and honestly a big honor to be at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Institut, the home of one of my favorite thinkers. And it's my first time here, so this feels very special to me to be giving a talk in this institute. Yes, as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm going to talk about gender today, and what I want to leave you with in this talk is the notion that feminism means more than women. And I think many of you might know this instinctively, but somehow it's difficult to keep this in mind when we try to understand what gender has to do with climate and energy. But I want to start with a story from the place that I have worked for a long time and where I came from when I moved to Berlin. And this is the gold star on this map, which is Blacksburg, Virginia. And this is a university town in the Appalachian Mountains, which is a major coal-producing region in the United States. And my story starts here. Thank you. A little more than 20 years ago, around 2002, the coal industry had a problem. And the problem was not profits in this time frame. Actually, coal profits had gone up and down, but in the turn of the 21st century, they were doing pretty well. The problem was that they were losing local support. So since about the 1980s and really ramping up in the 1990s, the coal industry had started using this technique called mountaintop removal, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's an extreme form of open pit mining, which I think there is also open pit mining in Germany, but this was open pit mining with explosives. So you just dynamite off the top of a mountain, and all of the toxic debris then fills up valleys and pollutes waterways. And local communities were really objecting to this practice. This was, you can see in this map, the location was often right near these local communities, schools, and so on. And in addition, and related to these practices, jobs from the coal industry were really decreasing. So while the production of coal was relatively static, for decades, really, the number of jobs that the industry provided had gone down. So the problem for the coal industry was that this threat that the public might turn on the industry and demand better, especially better regulation from the state. Because these states, Kentucky, West Virginia, Tennessee, Virginia, were really permissive, especially in allowing mountaintop removal. And so in 2002, when my story starts, a man named Bill Rainey, who was the head of the coal lobby, called a meeting for the industry to come up with a plan. And this is Bill Rainey meeting with West Virginia politicians. The result of their meeting was a multi-million-dollar public relations campaign called Friends of Coal, and it has been wildly successful. And the idea here was to attach people to coal, and that meant at this time to the coal industry that was at the same time harming the public. And this was no easy task because historically coal workers in Appalachia had been vigorous enemies of the coal industry. They were not friends of the coal industry. But the idea here was that from friendships and solidarities that people felt around unions of coal workers, we would move that sense of allegiance towards the industry. And what interests me and other scholars working on this history about this campaign was how prominent gender was to the strategies. So Friends of Coal traded heavily in masculine symbols, tying coal to things like hunting, fishing, the military, football, NASCAR racing, so-called protector and defender ideas. And the nostalgia was for strong coal as connected to this idea of breadwinner men and traditional nuclear families. So the family was also very central to the campaign, and as you can see, it was often children and housewife-type figures were the women in these campaigns. And in fact, there was like a ladies' auxiliary of the Friends of Coal that was very much, figured themselves very much as the wives of coal miners or former coal miners. So this happened starting in 2002. So by the time we get to this, which is 2015, when Trump is first running for president, and he goes to this region and says, Trump digs coal. By this time, we already have this nostalgia in place for an old order. And again, the nostalgia was from fighting King Coal, which was the nickname for the industry, to being friends of coal. So what was once a sense of solidarity and love that was really connected to a union, these unions had been decimated, and now this love is being transferred over to coal itself and the industry. In part with this history, when Trump won, I first wrote about Petro-masculinity, and what I was trying to do with this argument was to make the claim that this consistent misogyny, anti-queer, anti-feminist politics that we see in the right was connected to the other facet that we see consistently, which is some kind of climate denial, or especially in petrostates like the US, an embrace of fossil fuels. That these things are structurally and historically connected, not just incidental. And I think you can really see that in the Friends of Coal campaign. But one thing that I noticed when I started talking more about petromasculinity, and on the left here, this was a roundtable hosted by a right-wing institute called Heartland Institute. So when this term took off a little bit, even among the right, who sort of harassed me, it was not wonderful, the like turning point, and they really didn't take issue with the idea. It was more that I had pointed it out and I had a problem with it. So there are these conferences on embracing petro-masculinity. But again, when I started talking about this concept, I noticed that what came to mind for a lot of people would say, oh yes, petro-masculinity, I see that all the time. What comes to mind for people is trucks. This is like the dominant image. And indeed, for me, in my own piece, the example I used was rolling coal, which is a phenomenon on roadways in the United States, where people modify the engines of their trucks to run on a kind of fuel that produces black smoke. And this is really interesting because coal, it's called rolling coal, but coal is not involved. So again, we're referring to this sense of power that is connected to something else besides what's happening. And I think the truck itself becomes this chance to be a bit sort of like a coal baron. But these kinds of examples that come to mind are often associated with the working class. So, and especially white working class men and women too. And this is also these are the people that are also often associated most strongly with right-wing populism. And I think even in Germany, when you think about who is really into AfD, you often think of some of the same kind of examples that circulate also in the US. And indeed, the group that is most likely to support MAGA and Trump in all the recent elections, according to exit polls, are white, working class, evangelicals. And this is interesting, because when they partition out non-evangelical working class and also Black and Latino working class in the United States, these groups favor Democrats by a little more than Republicans. And the evangelical aspect, meaning evangelical Christians, is interesting to me because white evangelicals are a cultural group whose number one political priority often has to do with gender. So these are people who are often brought to the polls against abortion, defending the traditional family, anti-queer, anti-trans. These are the kinds of issues that motivate these voters. So I continue to be interested in this nexus, this association between working class practices, capitalist power, and gender. And I think it raises some tricky questions. You might call it the paradox of patriarchy, which is, you might ask, if men have all the power, why do I feel powerless? And I think in order to answer this question, we need to understand how gender works to uphold capitalism, and again, get beyond thinking about feminism as meaning only women's issues or the plight of women, which of course is very important to feminists. But this means more than noticing that women are underpaid, or women could better participate in the economy, for example. Women are disproportionately harmed by climate crisis. It means looking at how the sexual division of labor, and especially the traditional family as a social unit, has helped to uphold power differences in the system, and how these roles and the family has worked within and through working class politics. So again, I'm going to first give you a rather theoretical conception of how I think about feminism and how gender upholds capitalism, and then I'm going to try to give a couple more interesting stories. So when energy is the topic that I've been most interested in, and it remains the case today that when you enter a room and people are going to talk about energy, they almost always are staying within the realm of exchange, meaning we're talking about supply, demand, price, the market, etc. And of course, we're all here at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Institut, so we understand that Marx helped us see that the realm of exchange has this hidden abode, which is the English translation of Marx, the hidden abode of production behind it, where exploitation happens and where we should really be focused. And I venture to say that probably a lot of discussions today will be about this sphere of production. And decolonial scholars and feminist scholars have made further, I think, additions to Marxist thought by saying that things don't end here. Behind the realm of production, there are further hidden abodes. And people like Nancy Fraser or an older ecofeminist named Maria Mies have talked about, or you might categorize this into 3 different hidden abodes. And I've here called them just, you could of course trouble each of these words, but care, colonialism, and nature. So in other words, in order to reach production, we have a lot of domination, unpaid, invisibilized work happening via racism and colonialism, via the reproductive sphere, the sphere of care work, which often happens through gender, and assuming that we have kind of cheap nature to draw on. And these are not separate. So this is really me not knowing graphic design very well and having to rely upon PowerPoint, because care is racialized as well as gender, as well as naturalized. And the realm of nature is racialized and gendered. And the colonies are a place, as I'm going to show you in a second, where all these things come together, what is conceived of as nature to be extracted from, racial hierarchies and gender hierarchies. But it's just helpful to think about them, I guess, separately also. It's the challenge of intersectional thinking, I think. Okay, so this is rather abstract, all these words and theories. So again, I want to turn more to the bottom up and think a little bit about an example. And let's go back to this idea of the family, because on the far right, the family is held up as a timeless institution, indeed going back to the Bible often, the biblical family. However, the family, as feminist historians know, is a historical institution, and the sort of nuclear family that stands alone as a contained unit that we have today is really a rather recent social unit. And it kind of cements itself in the 19th century alongside industrialization. And in this period of time, historians talk about a cult of domesticity that arises, really in relation to the rise of industrial production, and conceived of as this space where love happens, where all of these things that are supposedly not part of the hard working world and the competitive marketplace, all these values of selflessness and care and love are happening in this idealized space of domesticity, overseen by a gentle, fragile, and white housewife. So this space is not only the escape from the working world, but it's also really important, I think, to capitalism as the place that is the underbelly, but also the love and affective support, the place where you go to get these things that we're told are missing out in the public world. And you can also see this paralleled in how nature starts to be conceived, also segmented into spaces where extraction is happening, spaces that are sacrificed, and then spaces that are to be kept wild and pure and untouched, where we go to do leisure and recreate. I think there's a very close parallel here. So the bottom line is nature is feminized, and women in the family are naturalized, and both are supporting this world of capitalist production with fossil fuels. So a lot of the opening of my talk came from Appalachia, and this example comes from a lot of scholarship in Victorian England and the world of industrialization as it happens in 19th century British Empire. But I wanted to turn to a German example because, again, I think I mentioned Maria Mies, who's an author whose work I really love, and a German scholar. And her book, Patriarchy and Accumulation, on a world scale. And Mies writes about something called the housewifization of the world. And with this concept, she's insisting that the housewife, this woman here, is a colonial and global figure, not just this sort of nice white British lady. And the example that she uses is from the period of German colonization. And in the German colonies, the housewife really played a role in securing white domination, similar to many of the other European colonies. So the first German colonizers, for example, to East and Southwest Africa, were largely single men, and it was common for there to be different kinds of relationships with local African women. But this pretty soon started to be understood as a problem. And the problem was that colonial rule is based on white supremacy. White men have power and wealth. And if we start to have miscegenation and we start to have mixed race families, it then becomes difficult to sustain white supremacy. And so an explicit policy was launched in about the early 20th century to recruit German women to move to the colonies and marry these men. They were trained in colonial schools for women in farming and cooking and housekeeping, because a big part of their job was not only to have the white babies to reproduce whiteness, but also to insist that the white household order and this role of the housewife and how you take care of your home was the mark of white civilization that differentiated that space from others. And this was especially important because the household was always a place of anxiety for reproducing whiteness, because especially in the colonies, a lot of the labor in the household was being provided by people, the colonized peoples. And there was love there between nannies and servants, and the fear was that the white children would not adequately have loyalty and solidarity to whiteness because they were being raised kind of outside of, in this case, Germany. So in this case, you can see how the German housewife becomes an important colonial figure. And indeed, a scholar named Monika Matliner has recently called these women, and this is my, well, not really my, it's Deep L's translation of what she described them as the border guards of German civilization. And I think that's a great term to think about who is guarding these, some of these boxes, these hidden abodes that we talked about. Okay, so going back to Appalachia, right around this same period, what's happening among these coal workers in Appalachia also is really complicated when you think about gender, race, and class. So this ideal of the family was definitely a bourgeois ideal. It was not a working class practice or ideal. Nevertheless, the working class did come to adopt the bourgeois family. And I think in this period of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, historians show, though, that the working class family was more often used in resistance to capitalism than it was in support. And this is because working class families tended to be more open to communities. There was much more mutual aid going on. So the notion of, especially the bourgeois notion that the family was this really separate, independent unit, had not really taken hold in the working class in this period. Nevertheless, these gender roles did have a conservative tendency for working class politics, and I think we are seeing some of the effects of that today. So you might think of labor resistance in this period as a gendered class power. So just as the families of colonial Germany were highly structured, so too was family life, for example, in this very same period, for coal families in Appalachia. And on the right, you can see a picture of a typical mining town. And because of the geography of this region, these towns were very isolated. They were entirely built by and owned by the mining companies. And in fact, often miners were paid in company scrip, and they had to then spend it at the general store owned by the company. And women were almost never permitted to work in the mines. And so these towns became especially gendered in the sense of the sexual division of labor. Unlike, for example, cities in this period in the United States, where women in the working class were often working. And really, until late in the 20th century, these regions, these former coal regions, women who lived here still did paid work at much lower rates than women in the rest of the country. And maybe I could speak later about this, but this pattern persists. So I have one of my co-authors has done field work in the towns where they frack for gas in the Dakotas, and these are called colloquially man camps because they are majority male towns. There's a lot of sex work that happens. There's a lot of strange gender politics that go on there. So this story of working miners, you know, when we think about miners in this region, they are often pictured as white men, and it does underplay how much women in this region did paid work, unpaid work, went on strike, were really crucial in supporting strikes. So the gender roles were constraining, and yet they were also the container through which people resisted. So to this day in this region, a lot of environmental justice movements are led by women who often do so through the role of mother and wife. So concern about children's health, for example, is a prominent reason. So this is a little bit about this sort of early period of the late 19th and 20th century when coal really was booming. And the second example or place I want to take you to is what happens when fossil fuel use accelerates, often called the age of acceleration. This is the post-World War II period in the United States. And this is when you get plastics as part of everyday life. Incredible intensification of car culture. You get suburbs, all of these things that we associate with the so-called American dream. And notice this is precisely the period that is most resonant for the nostalgia of the right in the United States. It's as if history begins in the 1950s. We have the Bible and we have the 1950s. And you can see these are ads from this period, all from the 1950s. And you can see how productivism, and masculinity become ever more tightly bound up with industrialization. So here, strong men put energy to work. And what I find interesting is on the left, you have images from the United States, and on the right is from the Soviet Union, where you had like very similar imagery around energy and electrification and industrialization. And recently, I also read that although in the Soviet Union you did have to a large degree, you had a lot of women working and a lot of gender norms really transgressed, and women taking part in the public sphere. At the same time, historians who have studied this period say that housework was not at all changed. So Soviet women were working, but then they were going home and still doing all of the housework. So in some ways, I think this is a nice way to see how gendered class power is at work in this period, regardless of which regime of industrial production we're talking about. And the other thing to note is that the strength of energy or electricity, the strength of men's bodies, is very tightly connected to the strength of the nation, to the idea of nationalism. So this post-war period also turned this bourgeois family ideal into a more mass consumerist ideal, spreading widely into and beyond, into the working class and beyond the bourgeois, the middle class. Here, fossil fuel things were consumed as the reward for production, also just as what you needed to sort of get on with life because people were not really choosing this way of life. They were sort of living in the infrastructure that was built for them. And so the household combines these three modes of domination: gender, colonies, and nature. The house is a feminized space, a white space, and a space where nature is enjoyed in this highly ordered way of the green grass lawn. And all of these trappings of the ideal family, this breadwinner job, having a housewife, having this mass consumerist suburban home, having a car, all of these were made more difficult in the United States for Black families and families of color. And since Reconstruction, really, Black families were policed and under surveillance according to these norms in very similar ways that these border guards of German colonies were working, like what counts as a civilized home. So the nuclear family, this middle-class fantasy, really becomes a social unit for the working class, too, in this period. So looking at this history, we can maybe return to this paradox, and I hope it's clearer now that patriarchy is not about all men being in power, and it's not about all women being oppressed in the same way or having the same experience. And patriarchy under capitalism is about a gender order where some elite men have power through capital, and really benefit from and rely upon these hidden abodes of extracted work. So patriarchy also, though, promises, especially working class men, a proximity to power, but ultimately ends up being a site of anxiety for many men who are made then to feel personally to blame for not achieving all of the trappings of traditional masculinity. So how might this help us, turning to the climate and energy politics of today? How might all this history inform how we think about energy and climate movements? And I think first, it would be to think more critically about production and productivism, meaning the ideology of production as inherently valuable. And this connects for me to this notion of the desire for ever more energy. And I think where we go here then is to understand that, yes, we can see petro-masculinity, especially in the far right. In some ways, the far right is the most intense form, but we can also understand this as a mirror. We can understand petro-masculinity and indeed this affective desire for fossil fuels as a much broader phenomenon, and one that might cross over into other forms of energy. So the dominant way of doing energy politics often expresses what has been called eco-modern masculinity. This leans heavily upon technology to fix climate problems and seeks to maintain this status quo of capitalist production and growth, and of these hidden abodes of care, colonies, and nature. So from this perspective, then, it's not so surprising to see Silicon Valley turn towards Trump in the United States, for example. And we might also be more worried about the kind of neoliberal tech approach to a lot of green politics that I also see happening in Europe. So second, I think in terms of labor movements, the problem of gender helps us think about the importance of emotions and social relations in energy politics. So this nostalgia around gender works because gender was and is an important container for how modern communities have been knitted together. It plays an important role for how people experience love. And these community ties have really been devastated by the coal industry in Appalachia, for example, and in a lot of these former extractive zones. So the nostalgia, I think, reveals the desire for this sense of community, of solidarity, for a space that is not a zero-sum world of market competition and exploitative work. And most politics of just transition sort of miss this with the focus on jobs and the focus on having cheap energy prices, for example, or a focus on energy independence. They tend to be more technocratic, and these are important, but they neglect how work didn't just bring incomes to these communities. It brought meaning, it brought social relations. And today, in Appalachia, for example, many jobs available are in so-called pink-collar work, so healthcare, education, that are feminized, that are existing in a neoliberal world of alienated communities that are underpaid. So this job substitution idea, especially in the United States, doesn't at all reach people at this level in terms of meaning and community. And this is third, the problem that I have with how gender often enters discussions about energy. And it usually enters in a liberal feminist framework, meaning we're going to focus on representation and distribution. And it's hard to critique liberal feminism because no feminist is going to be against talking about a more fair distribution for women, more equal representation for women. However, the way liberal feminism treats the problem of energy really doesn't touch this deeper structure that we've been talking about and how the sexual division of labor upholds capitalism. So this slide is especially hard because the USAID has been decimated. So it's hard to critique the USAID when now we don't even have the USAID in the United States. But nevertheless, this is an example of a kind of liberal feminist approach to energy. And what I really note here is the dotted line from the wind turbine to the bag of money that floats over the heads of these women. So here energy is really connected still to this idea of productivism, accumulation, and colonial capitalism. And all we need to do is just plug in more women to the equation, and then it'll be fine. So this is a line that I really love from someone who has more broadly studied neoliberalism, Michelle Murphy, where she says, you know, she critiques liberal feminism too and sort of says, well, it's like, I seem to be able to just either I have this option to care or not care at all. And like her, I don't think that's the only answer. I think it's important to insist there are other options. So I'll leave you with the thought that although the traditional family was and is the unit around which many communities form, that's not the only way communities have been built, and that's not the only way communities can be rebuilt. And there are small but exciting movements in Appalachia that focus on just this: how to rebuild post-coal life in a way that honors social relations, in a way that honors the land and people's relationship and connection to the land, in a way that doesn't treat the land as property or as the dotted line of pointing to a bag of money. So to conclude, feminism means more than women. It means more than gender. It's important to look beyond the individual behavior of men and women, which is often what comes to mind when people think about petro-masculinity. And yes, there are working class practices that are really symbolic of petro-masculinity, but it's important to see and think about this deeper sexual division of labor and how that upholds colonial capitalism. And that's why the fight against fossil fuels is inherently a feminist fight, and it's not only for women, but for everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks to Cara for this very instructive presentation and for raising a lot of questions regarding the relationship between capitalist production on the one hand and the hidden abodes of this sphere on the other hand, which are very crucial, I think, for our discussions here and in the workshops that follow. Yeah. So we have time for a couple of questions from your side. So you are free to raise your hands. We have a microphone for the audience, and please raise your questions. I see two here. We collect Nora Rätsel, please, and you are the next, please. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you very, very much for your talk. It was very insightful. I learned a lot. And I have basically just one question, comment kind of thing. And that's about masculinities. Because I think there are masculinities and masculinities. And even if you go into, no, not even, but especially if you go into the production process, the identity of workers there, female workers, but male workers, since we're talking about masculinity, is also very much about caring what they're doing, do it in a proper way, do it in a way that it's useful for those who are going to use those things. And I think it's important to recognize that contradiction, working for abstract value, but at the same time, working with concrete things and being careful and liking and finding a meaning in the specific work that you are doing. And I think as a counter movement to this dominant masculinity, I think that's an important element to connect with.
The next question is here. We collect the questions.
Yes, thank you. I'm Kime Pflücke. I work in Cottbus, which is in Lausitz in the East German mining region for brown coal. And I do really cherish your concept. It's something that I feel very close to. But I do have a few maybe questions to how you identify the types of masculinity or petro-masculinity with between ideology and real practices or real people. Because I feel that a lot of us are going, probably also in this realm, for similar concepts where we do see the problematic side of today's late capitalism. I'm related to a specific group of people. For example, there's also terms like digital brotopia or so on to criticize a certain way of exploiting life in capitalism today. And I feel like we do need to maybe differentiate between ideology and the people themselves. Like there's this, the real people are always better than their culture, something that Adorno said, also referring to masculine men in a very nice aphorism on masculinities in his times. And when I speak to workers in the coal relations and coal labor relations, they often, on the one hand, they are also sad about what they are doing to themselves and also to themselves, not just to the nature around them, right? So there's this very ambiguous thing of needing to feel powerful, but also talking about, for example, health issues or whatever they are doing to themselves or their kids or whatever. So I wanted to ask you maybe that, how do we, can we not, fight the system, not the players maybe, and is that something that you deal with in your concept?
One further question by Frank Hoffer, and then Cara has a chance to respond.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. I have a bit of a question about the idea of petro-masculinity. I did not fully get why this forms of masculinity and exploitation is so related to coal or oil. What changes if we have solar masculinity? If we have people who are building the kind of windmills in the North Sea, that's the last cowboys of masculine work, you know, it's dangerous, it's hard, it's a real man who is required for doing this. So your pictures would perfectly fit for this type of work. So I actually find your discussion about masculinity very interesting. I just don't think that putting a Petro in front of it adds much.
This is on? Okay. Thank you. I learned so much through your really sharp questions about advancing my own thinking, so I appreciate your attention and your questions. So first, the idea of different kinds of masculinities. Right, yes, there's a whole world of understanding masculinities in the plural, and hegemonic masculinity, and hegemonic masculinities being actually different in every place and different times of day, depending on where you enter. So as a set of social relations, it's very complex, and one of my mentors, Martin Holtman, has written a book called Ecological Masculinities, where he really tries to explore and surface alternative styles of masculinity that are more caring. And I would say even in the realm of these communities in Appalachia, historians have watched how what counted as the kind of ideal masculinity went from being a good labor leader, someone who took care of your union, to alongside the sort of Reagan neoliberal era to really a more focus on being a hard worker. So in some ways, the ideal itself in that period, in this place, loses some of those social values. But of course, with any particular person and culture, community, it's different. So this then bridges over into the question about trying to name a broad pattern, but then what do you do to appreciate context and the complexity of everyday life? In some ways, it's what we're all navigating as we're all being fed certain ideologies of gender, and then we're both performing them and not performing them and trying to figure out our own role, and an individual person is never going to be the replication of that. I would say the thing I'm trying to work through in this talk is this problem of why working class practices are always the symbol for the far right, when indeed you could say it's more these elites who are not driving the big coal rolling trucks who are the problem. And it's both and. It's both that these practices do exist, they have meaning, they actually translate into really difficult politics on the ground. But at the same time, I think the reason working class masculinity comes up is a bit of a deflection in terms of capitalist power, where, especially in the US, this concept of white trash, which is often used to talk about men and women, white families who live in these Appalachian regions, is once again helping to uphold this system, because it's saying that they have somehow failed at whiteness, they have somehow failed at these gender roles, and really it's about meritocracy, like it's their problem for having failed instead of a structural issue. So yeah, I don't know that I have an answer to how do we toggle between ideology and the lived reality of people. And I do think that frequently when I talk about petro-masculinity, these frequently are questions as people say, but yes, I see that, I recognize it, and when I'm in everyday life, it's more complicated. So I don't know, I often turn to Gramsci to think about what is hegemony, how does it work? Because I think it is important to kind of find a language for it, but then, of course, not to have it crystallize into... so maybe the answer is we just need both kinds of work happening all the time and constant reminders that this is not an actual description that captures people perfectly. And then, why fossil fuels? What a great question, because I was trying to gesture at the end there to eco-modern masculinity. I do indeed think that this form of elite practice, or this form of symbolic form, is not tied necessarily to fossil fuels, but historically it is. Because even if we think about the way solar and wind are being developed, there are many ideas about what a solar or wind future could look like. And some of those ideas are trying to map fossil fuel understandings of energy onto other kinds of energy. And I think fossil fuels are important because, and this was more from the work I did in the history of energy in the 19th century, fossil fuels are important because they were part of a shift of how people conceived of the earth. And fossil fuels, along with other things, allowed for people to think that infinity was not only desirable but achievable somehow. Even as, starting in the 19th century, people always were aware that there were limits, like Jevons about the exhaustion of coal in the 19th century. But this vision of free, unlimited energy is really connected to fossil fuels. And so that's one thing. But the other thing, of course, is histories of actually fossil fuel workers and how central they were to the building of modern modern liberal democratic states in the North, which is a kind of a bigger history. But yeah, maybe we can talk later. But I really do think fossil fuels are crucial.
And I would say it's also fossil fuels that help us to construct solar infrastructures, yeah, particularly the deep sea and windmills, yeah, and concentrated wind parks in the North Sea or in other places. Yeah, we would have time for one or two further questions. Is there somebody who would like to contribute? Yeah, two questions. Oops, three short questions. Yeah. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, hello, I'm Janis Perzelmeier with Urgewalt, NGO here in Berlin. And we're working, I'm personally working a lot in the US space with the World Bank. And there we see that the word gender is kind of erased out of all policies right now. Fossils and masculinity are celebrated. And yeah, we're facing this problem at the moment, so we're kind of, I don't know, helpless in a way. And just wanted to ask if you have a strategy or at least an idea of how we could start spreading feminist thoughts and even the word gender again. Thank you.
Julia Kaiser, bitte.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. If I understood correctly, you try to reconstruct a bit historically how that culture of petro-masculinity can be explained maybe, and how it comes from the real material conditions in which the male workers lived. And I was wondering, because now, of course, I think the other speakers were right, if we try to now sociologically to reconstruct the identities of those workers, they are probably much more differentiated and people try to find sense in different parts of their workplaces and communities. But I was wondering whether you or other researchers try to find out whether there are organic leaders in the workplaces or communities which somehow practically help those right-wing forces to find the right pictures or narratives. Like if there's any kind of work which tries to explain also on a current, the current situation regarding how that culture, that cultural mixture in between management interests and those communities, which, simply spoken, one could say, okay, those people or working class communities take any picture which, maybe fits to the interest of not losing the job, but there will be concrete practices which, somehow are developed maybe, and I was interested whether you have any kind of research, you or others, done in that direction, how such culture production is actually taking place.
Okay, Oliver Pai, the last contribution, please.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the wonderful film Pride, but for those who haven't seen it, it's a must-watch about this topic. It's about a group called Gay and Lesbians for Miners who was supporting the Great Miners' Strike in the early 80s in the UK. And it really shows very well what you're talking about, the masculinity in these mining communities, but how this was then challenged by these activists. And it ended up with the miners then leading the Pride demonstration in the UK, I think in 1985. So my question is, what's happening in the US now in these communities? How is this masculinity being challenged by new feminist approaches?
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, gender in the World Bank. Yes, I actually have a very dear friend who worked on gender in the World Bank and just was fired last week. So I feel you. And I personally don't have the answer or a great strategy. I think there are probably other people who would be better experts on that. I would just say, again, the more that we can understand gender as part of this complicated intersectional system, the better, because then we can have more alliances where we're not, we don't get siloed into we're just concerned about women's issues over here, and over here we're just concerned about environment. This is still a very prominent division in movements in the United States, that the environment talks about nature, and then racial justice talks about race. Actually, racial justice movements are the most intersectional of them all in the United States, and I think probably a place to learn from how to do this politics better. So I just feel I don't have an answer. It's really hard. And I'm here too because I didn't find that there were great opportunities in the United States to do the research that I do. Okay, the question about how does cultural production actually take place, I'm not 100% sure I understood. I think you were asking exactly who, are there leaders, actually how does it happen? For example, Friends of Coal, how does it actually happen? Was that the question?
Yeah, whether there are connections to, for example, trade union leaders, who once maybe also could be the leaders of Pride or whatever, I was just mentioning, who now turned into that game of...
Well, in this case, I think a lot of how Friends of Coal could happen, from the research about that I know, is that there actually were not very strong unions at the time anymore. They had really been fought and decimated. There weren't as many coal jobs, so I think the picture might have looked different if there had been. And that's I mean, maybe that's a question for people who study what's happening right now in former coal regions in Germany and how this cultural production is happening from the far right. In this case, it was appealing to a lot of, again, gendered practices, but also working class culture, but detached from working class solidarity around unions. And I think this is why we don't necessarily see this working as effectively in places in the United States that have stronger or more worker organization. And maybe that relates to the last question about interventions. Yeah, I think, you know, the danger of studying especially, or for me to think about masculinity, because a lot of my work before that and since that is more about feminist and movements and thought. And it's interesting because people are often much more comfortable with studying feminism, and when you start to talk about masculinity, it gets really, I've noticed, not in this room, but in rooms I've been invited to, it often gets a lot more touchy. But anyway, thinking about how to intervene in these practices, I think that's a beautiful example of pride. But I would also say, and what I tried to say in the talk was, if we keep thinking about the miner, the white male worker, this is important to think about, but there are a lot of other people working in the United States and even not doing paid work. This is remains a big problem for feminism, is to think about how do you do working class solidarity among unpaid care workers, for example, or poorly paid care workers who might be doing very work where they're not knit together in a workplace in a kind of traditional sense. And this might be the place to look for how to change those practices, because actually even in Appalachia, historically, there are lots of examples of women and black workers being part of these movements really seamlessly in many cases. There's a lot of positive examples among coal working communities. So it's important, I guess, not to, one, be aware of how these elite manipulations of public relations are effective, but also to be aware that historically they're only effective in a certain context, and then to think about maybe how to work on that context. I'm sorry, yeah, maybe that was not the best answer, but a good question. Thank you.
Yeah, many thanks to Cara again for discussing with us and for presenting your ideas on the labor, environment, patriarchy, coal, capital nexus. Yeah, I think that was very instructive and a very good starting point for our conference. I see some legacies or some questions which we are going to discuss further in the coming plenaries and also in the workshops. So the question of working class subjectivity, that was also raised by Nora, the change of working class subjectivities in the course of the developments that we're currently experiencing. I think also this idea of the border guard that you mentioned, with respect to these colonial families in German colonies, is quite interesting, because border guard shows that the border is contested, that we have to think about how to rearrange the relationship between the capitalist production and its hidden abodes. The border is contested. I think that is a very important point. It's also contested today. And the third thing that I found remarkable in our discussion is this ambivalence of the domestic sphere, of the relationship between the domestic sphere on the one hand and the productive, the sphere of the economy on the other hand. I think on the one hand, the domestic sphere is a place of creating hegemony, but on the other hand, it can also be a place of creating resistance, particularly the relationship between the domestic sphere and the productive sphere. The fact that workers are embedded in communities and have kids and are concerned with everyday questions and also of environmental destruction and health problems is a point to approach or to think about alternatives. Many thanks again. Now you have the chance to take breath, but not to take a break. Please stay seated. Yeah. We go directly on. We continue with the first panel, and I'm happy to hand over to Melanie Pichler as the moderator, and to Simon Schaub, Stefanie Hürtgen, and Silpa Satech as the panelists.